My name is Raúl Ayala. I'll act as your moderator. I am co-chair of the Criminal Justice Section Committee Alternatives to Incarceration and Diversion. It's kind of a far cry from well-being of lawyers, but I'm also co-chair of the Hispanic National Bar Association Attorney Well-Being Committee, and this is of keen interest to me personally and professionally. I am a recovering alcoholic, and so these types of programs have meant a lot to me over the last several years, and so every opportunity that I get to put together a stellar panel like you'll meet in a minute, I take full advantage because I do think it's something that we should continuously talk about and explore how to assure our long-term well-being aside from alcohol or drug addiction issues or mental health. I mean, our profession, of course, brings us a lot of stress, how to deal with that in a more productive manner so it doesn't cut us short, doesn't shortchange our firms or our clients. So before we get started, I just want to take a moment to reflect on some of the losses that we've had, both as a profession and as a society. Not to go through each one of those. I mean, we all can think of several that have happened in recent days, months past. But they affect, I think, us as not only human beings and as members of our society, but also as members of our profession, right? We took an oath to defend our Constitution, and we took an oath to try to help, our clients in dealing with some of the most pressing issues that they face in their lives, or even corporations with some very, strategic or very critical decisions that they have to make. And, we do I do, and I'm sure a lot of us do take into effect what goes on around us, right? So that's like another extra layer, I think, of stress that we might be feeling, some of us might be feeling, in terms of, well, what's happening within our democracy and our society. And I often feel as a lawyer, what special responsibility do I have to respond, right? I can respond to my clients individually, but I'm not really addressing the larger issues. So I mention that because I do think that that's another stressor that brings us closer, that affects us more than, let's say, an engineer perhaps, or some other profession. So I just put that in. And then being in his old hometown, take a moment to remember Jeff Adachi, who was a very avid criminal defender, and as you know, one of the few elected public defenders in our state and probably in the country. Hard charging. I'm not going to get into whatever is in the newspaper, but obviously I think there's a well-being connection there somewhere that we should think about. So it hats off to Jeff and his dynamic life in his hometown. So today we have really a stellar group. I'm really, really enthused with all three of you to accept our invitation to be here. Literally cutting-edge leading professionals in their respective right. I'm going to introduce them alphabetically, and I'll be very brief about my introduction because I think you'll see what they do and who they are, and if you refer to the materials, you get a better feel about what they've contributed to this area. But the topic, as you know, is well-being for the public interest professionals, right? And I made it a point to distinguish us from the regular, either a big law or a private practitioner type form, right? Because it's a different work environment, and we'll get into some of those nuances. But so I wanted to focus in on public interest professionals, and even if you're not a public interest professional and you stay here, you're going to find a lot that's going to apply. So please don't feel offended, or put off. And the other part, of course, is whether or not we're engaged or invisible. Are we going to be proactive or reactive, or pretend it doesn't exist? So that's kind of like the underlying challenge. What are we going to do in light of what's going on in our profession, and in light of what's going on in our offices, in light of what's going on within us? What can we do to not only survive, but to thrive? That Anne will explore more fully as we go down the line here. But so that's kind of the challenge, So here's the situation. How am I reacting? What can I do to make not only my life but my working environment better, right? And I think we all win from that. So Ann is from her prior life, a big law firm, a very successful lawyer, switched gears after almost 20 years of practice, decided to get a master's in applied positive psychology. Think about that. That's good stuff, right? And some of us sometimes think, well, what is applied positive psychology? And she'll explain that to you. And that not being enough, now she's working on a doctorate on positive organizational psychology, which is really good stuff. And and I'm not here to sell books, but Ann does have a number of books, and I'll flash them during the presentation. But she has a book basically around the science of engagement, how firms can have more effective results, more healthy and thriving lawyers by doing certain that the firm and individuals can do within the firm. If you Google Dan, you'll find a lot of stuff that she's written. The materials, and I'll get back to the materials of where you can find them. She's written a lot of stuff, not the least of which, she had her hand in putting this report that we'll talk about, The Path to Lawyer Well-Being, which was put out by the National Task Force on Lawyer Well-Being a couple years back when ABA President Hillary Bass decided that we need to take a deep dive and see what the organized bar, and the ABA in particular, can do about this. Out of that report, which she'll go over, then she's the leading author, really, the author that put together the Well-Being Toolkit for lawyers and legal employers. So there's a lot of information in there, a lot of suggestions, if you want to do your own deep dive and look into what the science is behind it, or what other people are doing or written about it. It's chock full of resources, and if you get the electronic version, hyperlinks almost on every page that you can do some research. So you'll have access to these documents. The book, I'm sorry, you'll have to buy on your own. And then there's also another, as it relates to the ABA directly, she's also chair of the ABA Law Practice Division Committee on Lawyer Well-Being. So in short order, she takes her role in this area very seriously and very in-depth and very thorough. So I think you'll like what she has to say. I found this book last year at the ABA. It's called The Best Lawyer You Can Be, with a bunch of different authors, including Ann, of course. You might be able to find it here at the ABA or look for it online. It's a publication to the ABA Law Practice Division. So that's Ann in a nutshell. She's great. She's going to be our center point. She's got a great PowerPoint that we'll go through. And to add to that, I think the central figures in criminal justice, and this is the criminal justice section presentation, are, of course, prosecutors and defenders, and judges, of course. Not to exclude other public interest professionals. There's a bunch. There's county counsel. You all know what I'm referring to. But I wanted to focus in on two aspects, two primary roles. And so we have Christine Hammond. And Christine has was in private practice in a big firm for a while, and was prosecutor for many years, and primarily in New York State, in New York City. After many years of practicing, she was an executive director and founder of the Prosecutor Center for Excellence. And so her role is to train and to help prosecutors and to help prosecutorial agencies do a full assessment on a wide variety of issues affecting their practice, and now is looking also at well-being issues within the prosecutorial field. There's many more things that Christine has done. I'm going to make sure that we upload their resumes and their contact information. But if you Google any three other names, they're going to come up with what they've done and what they're doing. And then last but not least, in terms of the introductions, Jose Varela is a public defender through and through. He's kind of a local kid, if you will. He went to Moraga. He went to St. Mary's in Moraga, where it happened a bunch of my high school buddies wound up. At Bolt, was a co-editor of La Raza Law Journal there. was a LA public defender for about 6 years, San Diego County public defender for about 8, and then came up to Marin County, was assistant public defender for about 10, and now has been the public defender for about another 10. And what you'll hear from him directly, but what's very unique about Jose is he's been looking at these issues easily 10 years plus. I mean, he's invited me and others to come speak to the California. He's been active, a past president, and remains on the board and very active with the California Public Defenders Association, and has always addressed this issue about what goes on with the lawyer, right, in terms of well-being, and make sure that at many presentations that he has his hand in, that issue gets addressed. So without further ado, you've heard enough from me. We have a very distinguished panel here, and I'm very, very enthused. So, Ann, why don't we start with you? Give us some background on this recent interest in attorney well-being, please.
All right. So here's just a little bit of structure about how we're going to go about today's session. I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of the background of what is the data that we have on lawyer well-being and what has caused the recent movement and what is involved in that movement. And then we're going to talk about leadership and the enormous impact that leadership has on the well-being of followers. And then we're going to move into some more individual strategies of sort of things that you can do for yourself and then as leaders and colleagues for those that you work with. And also, especially because we have such a small group here, the panel is going to jump in as we go through, and please feel free to do that as well, that if you have specific questions as we go through, please, feel free to give a shout out so that we can make sure we respond to any individual questions. So starting with lawyer well-being. So maybe since you're here, you don't have the same reaction as a lot of reaction I get when I talk about this issue, which is like, really, isn't that an oxymoron, lawyer well-being? And I get it, right? That of course it's not an oxymoron, but we do have some work to do. And luckily, some of that work has started. So why now is there, if you haven't noticed, there is growing attention to lawyer well-being, thank goodness. And one of the reasons, it may be a main reason, that it's gotten so much attention in the past couple of years is there finally was a big study. In 2016, there was the largest study ever done of practicing lawyers and on their mental health. And the findings from that study, which I'll talk about in just a minute, really got some people's attention. And the level of concern catalyzed a lot of attention and some of the initiatives that we see percolating now. And one of them was the group that formed called the National Task Force on Wellbeing. And the main mission initially of the National Task Force was, we've got to get this data out there. People need to understand what the state of well-being is. So let's get together and write a report so that we can both raise awareness and also provide some ideas about what are the kinds of things that we can do to address these issues. And what the study was, this study in 2016, 13,000 lawyers, including both private practice and government and public interest lawyers. And these are the general statistics for all types of practicing lawyers. And the one that really got people's attention was the risk of alcohol use disorders. That it was, depending on how you look at the data, it was either 21% of lawyers up to 36% of lawyers were at risk of an alcohol use disorder. It was sort of mind-blowing. And the depressive symptoms, stress and anxiety also definitely got people's attention. But because the potential alcohol use disorders were so high, people really started paying attention to all of the areas, but especially to that area. And one of the reasons, a main reason for lawyers, like why this matters, first of all, like it is just a humanitarian issue. Like we don't want to be creating cultures and an institution that's creating these problems. Also, it's an issue of professional competence. That all of these issues of alcohol use disorders and mental health disorders impair our executive functioning. And so things like problem solving, memory, planning, all of these things that are absolutely essential to being an effective lawyer can be affected by mental health conditions and alcohol use disorders. And specifically with the alcohol use disorders, this is a chart that focuses just on that. And what the finding was that it was especially, it was an issue across the profession, but it was especially concentrated in young men in private practice. I will just ask, like, thanks for the 2 men that are in the room, but this is very common, that when I speak about well-being, women tend to be more interested. And what the study found is that the alcohol use disorder was way concentrated in men, not just men in private practice. And depression is the only study I've ever seen where the average rate of depression was higher among men. It's like across the world, women always rate higher in average depression for a lot of reasons. They tend to ruminate, and there's a number of different reasons. So there is an issue across the profession. There's also this, maybe a special issue with men who also are socialized, even less so than women, to not seek help. And so I do think, like, as we go forward in thinking about how to address this issue, addressing well-being with men might look a little differently than addressing well-being with women who may be a little more open to these ideas to begin with. And there was, when they did the data, they did distinguish between, like, they asked what your type of practice was. And so it did break it down by government, public interest, nonprofit. So there's a whole lot in that. So it's not necessarily prosecutors or public defenders, but you see that was sort of the group. And what they found was like 19% of that group were at risk of alcohol use disorders. And just as a comparison, private firms were 23%. So no one's doing awesome in this area. And with respect to the mental health issues, the depression, anxiety, and stress, it was actually solo private practitioners were the highest in those issues. Private practicing lawyers in law firms were second, and then this group of general public and nonprofit were third. And it doesn't really matter, that's just kind of interesting for comparison, but if there's any of the, we would love it to be zero. We'll never get to zero, but it sort of doesn't matter whether one is doing better than the other. There's an issue across the profession that we want to address. And then just thinking about, like, what are our challenges? There are studies showing, like, we have this issue of potential alcohol use disorders, depression, anxiety, elevated stress, work addiction, not enough sleep, high suicide rate. Like, these are issues that we're seeing in the profession, but what could we be? Like, thinking about what it is to be a lawyer and the meaningfulness of it, and helping the world become a better place. Like, it does have such enormous potential, and that's the vision that we want to create.
I was wondering if I could just kind of talk about the reality of this, okay? And one of the reasons I became involved in this is I suffered burnout. After the last death penalty case that I did, which was a terrible child torture case, I literally didn't know what was happening to my body. And like many men, as described in the studies, I thought it was win a case, drink a whiskey, drink a case, win a whiskey, and so you had that sort of, machismo sort of reality that came into trial work, and people were kind of feeling that was the pure reality of what we did. And it was only after going to burnout, I literally was trembling, and when I finished that last case, verdict came in, it was horrible, and I went to my local doctor, and he immediately said, we need to get you into a treatment. And so I went into a therapist, and came to find out that nutritionally I was done. I mean, I literally wasn't eating well, I wasn't sleeping well, my body was in pure exhaustion. And initially what we had to do was bring me back up to just health. In order to be able to do that. And one of the things that I think all of us that are lawyers is we study the things that we don't know. And I began to really study what the reality was about the burnout that I was going through. And I'm glad I did, because now as a leader of an office, one of the things is I learned about that. I learned that many of us who are in these professions are highly sensitive people. And I would recommend to you a wonderful book called The Highly Sensitive Person. It's an incredible book. It's an incredible book with a lot of strategies for being able to deal with that intense sensitivity. The notion of a closed door sometimes is really important for highly sensitive people. The use of sunglasses in rooms like this is oftentimes really important for highly sensitive people in order to stop the stimulus. And one of the things as lawyers we have is this innate attack of stimulus upon our senses. And everybody's expecting us to be saviors. And one of the things is we often do take on that mantle of saviorhood. And that's a heck of a mantle to take on. And so some of the things that I think we talk about are the realities of what we suffer. And to be able to have that, I will tell you, as we're talking about it now and we talk about the studies, it's really sort of getting facts. But to actually talk to a colleague that you see going through this, I got to tell you, those of you that are going to be offering that hand to a colleague that's going through this, it's going to be one of the hardest conversations you will have, because nobody wants to admit that they're not Superman or Superwoman. Nobody wants to admit that. And so as these studies come out, we all know the reality of it. We all know the reality of what it means to work in public interest. I will tell you that one of the things that I tell young attorneys is I said, now you've got this great job, you're going to do everything else like that. Not only are you going to battle to be competent, I also want you to be aware of the D's. And they said, what do you mean? I said, you're going to be battling the D's all the way through. I said, you're going to be battling drunkenness, drugs, divorce, depression, death, and maybe before death, disbarment. And the reality is, they kind of look at me, I said, yes, you're going to have to take care of this side of you. Okay? And so I want to make certain, and I'm sure all the colleagues here will talk about it, as we talk about this, we're talking about a human reality. And how many of you in the last 5 years have seen a colleague suffering through burnout or things of that nature? Raise your hand. Okay? I think every single one of us are real close to it. So it is something that these studies are they look like just numbers on a page, but are very real to us.
All right, thanks. So just on the issue of competence, like this one is obvious. Of course, well-being relates to professional competence, which is, a professional requirement that we remain competent. But for me, I didn't go to law school because I wanted to be minimum, have minimum competence. That I wanted to go to law school because I wanted to help make the world a better place. And this little statement from the ABA model rules, I thought captured this a little bit better. Lawyers should strive to attain the highest level of skill to improve the law and the legal profession and to exemplify the legal profession's ideals of public service. Isn't that why many of us, went to law school? And for us to be able to achieve that standard and really be our best selves as lawyers, well-being is a critical part of it. And that is why so many of us went to school, right? It wasn't just to make money or to solve problems, although solving problems is really great, but especially public interest lawyers. There is this, driving motive of what can I contribute? And so that's the other side of why well-being is so important. Because if we have a bunch of people, lawyers that are, burned out, stressed out, drugged out, they're not going to be able to be their best selves at work and really contribute to the world what they're capable of contributing.
And then before you go on, Christine, what do you think about that? How does that look in your world of prosecutors and prosecutorial agencies?
I don't think it's much different than what Jose was saying. It's quite similar. I sort of see prosecutors deal a lot with vicarious trauma because they can go to crime scenes, deal with crime victims, have to view autopsies and things that most corporate lawyers don't have to deal with. So there is that added element of tragedy that is part and parcel of a prosecutor's work. So I think that's, and of course as a defense attorney, but as prosecutors I think we're in that more and more directly. So that is another factor that is somewhat different and has to be thought about, different from a corporate attorney.
Mm-hmm.
And so what has been the organized bar's response to some of these issues?
So the first thing I mentioned, and Raúl, you mentioned as well, was the National Task Force report on lawyer well-being. And I was the editor-in-chief and one of the co-authors of the report. And one of the things that was important in the report was that we wanted to encompass kind of all lawyers, no matter where they were in the continuum, that it wasn't just about detecting and treating the existing issues of mental health disorders and alcohol use, risk of alcohol use disorders, but also full well-being. Like, just because you're not sick doesn't mean you're fully well. And so how can we figure out, like, what does the science say about that full continuum of well-being so that we can help lawyers, wherever they are on the well-being continuum, to strive more toward being their best selves and being able to contribute their best selves to their jobs, to their colleagues, to their families. And the recommendations, there's a whole bunch of recommendations, and they're broken down by sort of stakeholder. And so it's sort of a large, intimidating document, but you can like focus on the stuff that applies to you if it looks too big to read the whole thing.
Well,
there's
good.
a lot of resources in there, a lot of really great recommendations. And this was the well-being definition that we came up with, is the idea of emphasizing that it's a process. It's not like an Easter egg hunt that you find well-being, and then all is good. It's a lifelong process of continually striving toward well-being in all the dimensions of your life. That if you only focus on work to the exclusion of everything else, you're going to find yourself, harming your well-being. And after that, so after the National Task Force was not actually an ABA entity, but after the report was issued, the ABA, of course, thankfully got very interested in it and created its own task force. And one of the things we did as part of that task force was, it was especially focused on law firms, but there was the toolkit for lawyers and legal employers that it's freely available on the internet. I was the author of it, and I tried to find as many resources available. There's other countries like Canada and Australia, for example, are further advanced than the US in a lot of, in kind of the well-being sphere generally, but also within the legal profession. So the toolkit goes through all kinds of ideas of like, where do we start if we're interested? What are some specific tools? At the back of it, there's just a bunch of worksheets. So I've heard, lawyers have told me that they're getting together with like groups of other lawyers at lunch and just going through the worksheets, like one worksheet, every other week kind of a thing. Those are teaching well-being strategies. And then there's also the well-being pledge for legal employers that the ABA invited law firms and law schools to pledge that we really mean this. We're pledging to protect and pursue the well-being of lawyers, and they're required to then kind of report what they've been doing. And Raúl had the great idea of like, shouldn't we be doing this among public interest lawyers as well, of having a pledge for that group as well, and figuring out what are the kinds of things systemically that group can do.
Right. I've asked our federal public defender to take a look at that, and I think it's applicable. I'm sure you've written stuff on articles on judges. I'm sure the judges groups can also apply some of the pledges that are introduced there.
But I would tell you, this is not easy. When I first came to Marin County, I became the assistant public defender. I was finally in a leadership position to try to do something about wellness. And when I created a position for a work-life balance attorney, they would have a caseload, but they would also create work-life balance. I can tell you, many of my colleagues looked and said, "Are you nuts?" But I had been reading about wellness in the LA Daily Journal and had started to see what some really progressive firms were doing. And it really meant work-life balance, looking at alternative work schedules, looking at a lot of things. I will tell you a funny story that I get teased about quite a bit, is that in Marin County, the first person that we had come in to kind of talk about wellness was a feng shui coach. And the feng shui coach actually came in and taught us basically how important how we set up our offices were to our well-being. That how you set up your office is how you created a space that really belonged to you and really gave you the strength to be able to do the work you do. It really changed the culture in our office. What we came to find out after that was that people that became minimalist in the work they did actually had more control of their work. And to this day, our feng shui coach, every change of season, will send us a newsletter talking about this season means this. And I can tell you the harsh reality of going through the growth of that. But from that little experiment came a book club, came a lunchtime CrossFit club, came a fruit and vegetable exchange club, all kinds of things that basically let us realize that we were in touch with something else. And so I think that when we talk about the kinds of things you can do, I just encourage you to do something. Take the pledge, but actually say, I'm going to do something.
Yeah, and that's we're going to shortly get into the leadership aspect of this, of how important leadership is, and that's such a great example of that. So we want to talk just a bit about what the science shows are. Yeah?
I just had a question related to kind of the alcohol issues, because oftentimes I work in Los Angeles in a public interest firm that represents children in foster care. So we deal a lot with vicarious trauma and, on a daily basis representing children who are removed from their parents or who are guardians. And sometimes after work, they'll have a happy hour or celebrate something that's happening. And it's really hard sometimes to say, no, I don't want to go. They just stopped having alcohol on the premises of our firm. And now it's just recent. But yet, I just got an invitation to go celebrate someone's baby shower at the local, bar down the street. So they just take it from our office to there. What kind of things would you suggest we implement to encourage people not to place people in the settings where they can overindulge?
Yeah, so one of the recommendations in the report is to find alternative things that don't have alcohol. And I would say overall, the report is not saying eliminate alcohol, because that's not going to go over in the profession right now. And one of the professors that I work with does a lot of public health studies on how do you change behavior. And he said the most effective approach isn't to try to eliminate, but to try to reduce risk. And so one option would be don't tell people we're not drinking, that can cause a reactivity. Well, I'm going to drink then. But find something alternative that's also fun to do. And then if there is going to be drinking, how can you minimize risk? Can you have Uber available, have taxi vouchers, those kinds of things. But it's a challenging issue in a profession where alcohol is so much part of the culture. So I think the recommendations that I've heard from the experts who really study this is step one is not telling everyone to stop drinking, because that's not going to work. But what are ways to minimize risk? So helping our colleagues understand, if you have a trial tomorrow, if you're doing something important tomorrow, we're not going to go out drinking tonight. And just ways to make drinking more responsible, and then keep moving the professional culture along where we maybe just stop having as much alcohol as we do. Right. Does anyone else have any thoughts about that? It's a challenging issue.
Well, one of the things that we did, because I actually had an employee that says, Jose, I don't drink. I don't want to attend these events. I don't want to see, what happens to my colleagues after a few drinks. I don't want that, right? And so what we started doing was having lunchtime. Anything important was done at a lunchtime gathering with food. And only soft drinks and water were put together. And so, events that would normally have been Christmas parties or things of that nature, we started turning into white elephant gift exchanges. We started creating everything from 2 o'clock, from noon to about 1:30, creating those things. The other thing that we also started doing was when we realized that we needed a stand down of sorts, we would close the office for a half day. We would close the office for a half day and say, what is it that's going on here? Let's really talk about that, right? And so it really meant being aware of when the level in the office would get very stressed out. And so when I first got to Marin County, they used to have a tradition called the 508, because it was based on a calendaring system they had there. And at the 508, people would go to the bar, and there would be a ton of people, right? And I told people, I just really, that's not something that I want to encourage. I also had a lot of people that drank at lunch. And so they would invite me, and I said, look, I don't drink. I'm just sorry, I don't drink at lunch. I said, I saw one attorney go into court, and the client said, I don't want this attorney representing me. Why is that? He smells like beer, and I'm in a DUI trial, okay? That's a real thing that happens, okay? And so I basically, people realize that I, through role modeling, was really just saying, I really don't want my attorneys drinking at lunch. This is not a good process. But I can tell you, when I first started practice, drinking at lunch was pretty much a thing everybody did.
Christine, have you any thoughts along those lines? I mean, you know, prosecutors and law enforcement work hand in hand a lot. You know, there's the perception, whether it's right or wrong, that, for example, law enforcement drinks a lot after work because of the stress. You know, you got prosecutors who are prosecuting who know better, but I'm sure there are similar expressions of this kind of concern, right?
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of a fallacy about how close prosecutors and police are. We're often at odds more than people would realize,
Right.
because we have to judge their arrests. So, but of course, there are friendships that go across that. I think sort of going to the drinking, one of the things that we mentioned before was that drinking leads, at least I can see amongst prosecutors, to laughter. And we're often laughing about, and sometimes inappropriate and sometimes in inappropriate ways, about what we have dealt with during the day. And that is a tremendous release for all of us. And there are few people who understand what we've gone through other than each other. So there is this feeling like you want to get together with people who understand, because you go home, they might not understand what you're going through. And the drinking allows you to relax a little, then you start laughing, and then that feels better. Now, I'm not saying that this laughing is always appropriate, but it's also a mechanism to get out these anxieties in a way that feels less hurtful. But I think that what we're talking about here is common across all of us. But I do know just from my own group that there was this feeling where when we would get together, drink and laugh, it felt good.
Yeah.
But it may not always be.
Right. It's a release of that.
And we knew there were some who were going off the edge, you know, and just were losing control of their lives. And a few others were just using it in a way that maybe there is some appropriateness to that camaraderie and getting out the anxieties through laughter.
Yeah. So I think there's just other ways of doing that, right? It's a good release of tension, laughter. There's a whole section of laughter lawyers that use laughter as a therapeutic tool. There's a whole movement of that as well. So maybe it's incorporating that in a different way, right?
Yeah.
Not at 10 o'clock at night after we've all had 4 or 5 drinks, but maybe during lunch or
At
after
lunch,
work.
yeah, I thought that's a very good idea.
Do
Yeah.
something,
To do it
have
at
a comedy night or something to that
Yes,
effect.
yep.
Eh?
All right, so we just wanted to identify some of the causes of poor psychological health according to the science. And there's a lot of it that I think we don't necessarily think about in the realm of well-being. So long work hours, being work overloaded, like I think those are things that we sort of naturally think about. We know those are related to well-being. And some of it, there's not a lot we can do about. It's just part of the job. But some of the other things, things like ambiguous work, not really knowing what the expectations are, stagnant, not really learning new things, having low control over your life and your work. So especially in thinking about our roles as leaders of how we can help those issues with folks that we're working with. And work culture, like feeling a sense of low belongingness within your group at work is highly related to depression. Like, is that something we naturally think about as well-being related? Like, we don't, and it really is. Low organizational fairness, we'll talk about that in a little bit more. And relational is enormously impactful for well-being. Conflict, interpersonal conflict with in the workplace has one of the strongest relationships to depression. And so, too much instability, toxic leadership, loneliness, and then there's individual things that people tend to think more about when we talk about well-being as kind of our own health and wellness, our physical health, our nutrition, whether we're ruminators. But all of these things are things that we can think about addressing, that they really are, the cultural stuff relates to well-being as much as the individual stuff. So defining work-related well-being, I don't think I'm going to spend a lot of time on this. Basically, like, engagement is work-related well-being. It means you're energetic. When you're at work, you feel a sense of meaning and dedication, and you feel a positive challenge in your work. And burnout is sort of the opposite of that you're feeling emotionally exhausted. Depersonalization means you sort of you stop caring, you stop having a sense of compassion for the folks that you work with or are working for. And then low personal accomplishment, you just start feeling like you're just not growing. You're just not doing a great job anymore. And that's what burnout feels like. And so what we're trying to do is how do we get people to work-related well-being, which is engagement, and avoid burnout. And burnout it's a stress syndrome. So when you're continually under stress, not able to alleviate this stress, it can lead to burnout. But stress on its own isn't the issue. Like, all stress means is that we're being challenged. So generic stress isn't the issue, it's when it becomes distress. And it becomes distress when we're feeling like our perceived work demands are higher than our perceived ability to cope. And perceived really is a key issue here, that objective demands and objective resources do play a role, but it's much more about how we perceive the world. Do we perceive that we have resources, like colleagues that are going to be helpful to us, enough sleep? Those kinds of things make our bodies react differently when challenges are presented. So if you're feeling highly resourceful, good stuff going on in your work environment, and feeling healthy, your amygdala actually reacts differently to a stressor. That you will automatically feel like this is something that I can handle, rather than going into stress or threat mode. And there's a bunch of studies that really emphasize this point of stress is not as objective as you think it is. And one of my favorites is this series of studies on mountains or hills. In this series of studies, they had people are walking by and they stop them and say, hey, will you estimate the steepness of this hill? And for some of them, they said, we'd like you to think about your purpose in life, like really, what really gives you a sense of meaningfulness. In another group, they asked them to think about a specific example of someone they love being supportive of them. And in the third example, they asked them to think about someone they cared about who had betrayed them. And in each of these conditions, they then asked them to estimate the steepness of the hill. And in the conditions where they asked people to think about their purpose or meaningfulness, and people who were supportive of them, they actually estimated the hill as less steep. So I hope you're sort of excited about this as I am. What it means is that we have more control than perhaps we think we do about our perceptions of stress.
How many of you actually schedule in well-being time into your work schedule? Okay, good for you. And the reason I say that is because a lot of people don't. And I think at a minimum, people have to basically try to give themselves anywhere from 2 to 4 hours a week for self-care. And that can be anything that makes you happy. And I only learned that after my therapist, after I burnt out, did all this calculations about how I had handled stress and how I had defined it. And basically I was making mountains out of molehills in a lot of ways. And she realized that I did not know how to vacation. That every vacation I ever had was to go help a relative move, to go take care of a family matter, that I really did not know how to vacation. And then she asked me a question that said, when was the last time you were happy? And it was funny. I went back and I said, I was 11 years old, and I used to grab my brother's guitar when he would leave the house, and I would just kind of pretend to play the guitar, and it just felt so good. And she goes, then you know what you have to do. And ironically, as I was driving out of the Kaiser facility in San Diego, there was a guitar shop. So I went out and bought a guitar, right? And so what I started doing was every Friday I would go and play guitars at this guitar store. And so I would lay away guitars. Before I knew it, I owned 8 guitars, okay? But it was basically saying, when was the last time you were really happy without alcohol, without all of these things? And I think that one of the things that we sometimes have to be taught again is, I think what this study shows is that we oftentimes will turn stress into something much more than it really is. And our way of dealing with it is also as dramatic. And sometimes they're really actually very simple things to do to care for one another.
Yeah, and there's at least two great points out of what you just said. One is research on recovery from stress shows that, especially for individuals who have very intellectually challenging jobs like lawyers, mastery experiences are among the best stress relieving activities. So learning something new, like playing an instrument, is a fabulous idea. Sports are another one, being physically active. Are really helpful for people who have these intellectually challenging jobs. Well, we might think like sitting and watching TV, that sounds relaxing. It actually makes us feel more fatigued, especially with these intellectually challenging jobs. So that's a great example. And also of this idea of our perceptions of stress, that it's worse than we think, because we end up in a stress spiral. So what happens is when we remain preoccupied, like Jose was remaining preoccupied with his work and never turning off the stress response, our brain, we have limited mental bandwidth in our brains, right? And so if we're constantly remaining preoccupied with work, there's not room for other stuff. And so what typically happens is we work, oh my gosh, there's another challenge, so I have to keep working. I don't pay attention to my family. I don't pay attention to playing instruments. I don't pay attention to my physical health. And what happens is a thing called scarcity mindset that's actually studied. And it shows when you get into this position where you're letting go of all these resources that we're talking about and preoccupied with something like work, your IQ drops, and you are going to perceive all your challenges as even more challenging than if you had remained resourceful. So it is this vicious cycle. The more you remain preoccupied and don't build up your resources, the less and less you feel able to handle the challenges that are going on. And so this isn't like the stuff we're talking about, like it's not the icing on the cake, like it's part of the cake. Like to stay fully well, it is this idea of having a fuller life and turning off the stress response, at least for a while, so that your brain and your body can recover so that you can be your best. And in a way that we can think about like resilience or engagement in burnout, like is just simple scale, like the our justice scales. And what we're trying to do is build up as many resources as we can. Some of the demands, there's not a lot that we can do about, some of them we can. But the resources we can definitely boost up. And there's lots of science showing what are the resources that are particularly helpful to boost well-being. And when we're able to stay boosted up with resources, it helps buffer against all the demands and the stressors, so we're more likely to go toward engagement, work-related well-being, and avoid burnout. And some of it, I created my own framework based on, I synthesized a whole bunch of different areas of psychology and well-being to figure out what are the resources that are most important to promote well-being. And this is DREAM is what I came up with. We're developing dream teams. That's what we're doing. And we're going to explore some of these in more detail. But the basic gist of them, first is the idea of developing, of feeling that we're continually growing and that we feel competent. So especially with young lawyers or lawyers who are doing new things, if they feel ineffective, low in self-efficacy, low in competence, it's a big contributor to poor well-being. Relationships are considered among the most important contributors to well-being. So thinking both about your relationships at home, your relationships at work, in the sense of belonging that I mentioned earlier is also part of it. And energy has two components. One is just emotional regulation, which is the idea of boosting positive emotions, which people in jobs like we all have might have to be much more intentional about positive emotions than we might already be, and curbing negative emotions and the impact of negative emotions. And the second part of energy is just rest and rejuvenation, stuff like sleep, and eating well and exercising. And then autonomy, lots of studies on autonomy autonomy has sort of two different faces itself. One is authenticity, I think is a good way of describing it. And how you can think about that is what I'm doing aligned with my values and preferences? When I'm at work, am I who I really am? Am I following my values? Highly important to well-being. And the second part is, do I have a sense of volition and choice? Are people bossing me around? Is my work bossing me around? am I feeling that I'm making the choices that I want, or am I being controlled by external factors? And then last is meaningfulness. And this is an area that I study a lot. And you might be shocked, hopefully not, at the strong relationship that meaningfulness has with well-being. And there's a couple of different ways of looking at it. One is a sense of social impact, that what I'm doing is helping others or making a positive difference in the world, and self-growth. Am I growing and continually becoming better? Both of those experiences sort of help us have a sense of meaningfulness. And hopefully this is one of the areas that I really want to talk about, because it's so applicable to this group. There's really things that you can do to cultivate meaningfulness, and it has enormous impact on well-being. I'm not going to do this. And then I want to quickly just talk about how many of you are in a leadership position, by which I mean you have the ability to influence anyone else in your work. Probably most of you do. And so I just want to pause for a second to talk about the importance of leadership. That so much of what we've talked about in well-being so far in the legal profession is more the individual level well-being, and that's great. Like, we need to start somewhere. But what the research shows is that it's actually more of these contextual factors that interact with kind of who we are. So let's say I'm prone to stress or prone to like a sensitive person that you said. That doesn't sort of just happen all on its own. There's also things that are going on in the context or in the organization that make it more or less likely that that gets expressed. And so there's many studies now showing that it's actually those contextual factors that have a bigger impact on well-being than anyone's individual level resilience. And so the quote I have up is, one of my favorites to sort of get at this point, that if you pit a good performer against a bad system, the system is going to win almost every time. And so this focus on individual well-being, like meditation and stress reduction, all that, super important, but we can't forget the equal or more importance of these contextual factors, which, and a big one of those is leadership. And in the National Task Force report of the 44 recommendations, number 3, very high on the list, is that leaders themselves need to commit to well-being. They need to model it and show others both that if they just talk the talk and don't walk the walk, what people do is watch what you do, not just listen to what you do, and they see what's important by what you do. And also, leaders are there's lots of science showing that the higher you are in a hierarchy, the more you're watched, both for like, what are the expectations for me and what's valued here. And so for the people that didn't raise their hand about being leaders, I do think about it, you might be. The extent that you have any power over anyone else to influence them or make decisions about them, they are watching you. And what are they seeing? Are they seeing kind of well-being related lifestyle or not? And the research shows that it's especially the immediate supervisor that has the biggest impact on our work experience. They're watching you very closely, you have the biggest emotional impact. And so, what that suggests is then leaders, because they have such an enormous impact, they also have a big responsibility to lead strategies, like you're talking about, leading initiatives, and also modeling it themselves, which I think sometimes gets lost. I work a lot with big law and partners, and oh my gosh, think about what they're modeling. Emailing at 2 a.m, saying I'll sleep when I'm dead, all these kinds of things that this is, what are the junior lawyers then believing is valued in that organization. And I'm not gonna go through this whole video. I'm conscious of the time, but I want to tell you quickly what it is. Have any of you seen the Remember the Titans? It's an awesome movie. I love it. And this particular scene, they're integrating the football team, racially integrating the football team. And the head coach is an African-American fellow that's trying to integrate the team. And these two leaders of the team, the African-American leader and the white leader, are in an argument. And the white leader is saying, the African-American guys aren't doing their job. And the African American guys say, no, the white guys aren't doing their job. And ultimately, what the African American football player says is attitude is a sign of leadership. But you're telling me I have a bad attitude. I'm telling you if I had a bad attitude, that's a reflection of your leadership. And please watch the movie. It's so fantastic. But that was so impactful to me of thinking about my own role as a leader, that if the lawyers that I'm working with aren't behaving in the way that I want them to, if they're not engaging in the well-being to each other, in their own interactions, or for themselves, what am I doing or not doing that's supporting those behaviors? And I think that's just really important for us to keep in mind, that we need to be the ones setting the expectations and really shaping the culture.
How many of you have taken any classes in leadership? One of the things that I have found in public defender practice is that many of the people that were being placed in leadership positions were just people that were competent public defenders. To be a competent public defender is not to be a good leader. They're two very, very different things. And the reality of leadership is it is a trained sort of executive reality. And whether you're an executive director of a nonprofit, or you're in the hierarchy of a government office of any sort, the reality is it is important to study leadership. Books like Servant Leadership, books that really go into what it means to be a humble and accessible and listening leader. Those are skill sets that are incredibly important, because in a lot of ways, you're the ultimate referee, and you're the ultimate value setter of an organization, and you're the ultimate role model. In public defense, we have gone to what's called community-oriented defending, and it really is going out into the community and being an example. I'm going to share with you a very tragic situation that happened to me, but I share it with you to let you know how people are watching. One of the things that we have in our court systems is a lot of therapeutic courts. And one of the things that I do in the morning is I go have coffee at a Pete's Coffee Shop near our office, because a lot of our clients that are in recovery or have to stay sober will come see me in the morning. And I just encourage them, keep doing what you're doing, keep doing what you're doing. And one day I happened to, a friend said, oh, let's go have a beer at this place. And I said, well, I don't know, just one, right? So I go to this place and I have a beer. Unbeknownst to me, one of the people that used to come in the morning to tell me how they were doing with sobriety happened to walk into this place to buy a pizza. And the person is with his partner. And the partner tells me this story later. She says, Jim saw you having so much fun with a beer. He had been sober for 16 years. And he said, can I have a beer? Look how happy Jose is. I just want one beer. 3 days later, Jim committed suicide. Okay? And so Kim then tells me this story. And I got to tell you, it was one of the harshest realities of realizing that when you become a community-oriented defender, the breadth of your role modeling is really greater, right? And to some degree, that's one of the things that's very hard about leadership. It's a lonely place. It's a lonely place because if you're going to be the kind of leader that walks the walk, you really walk the walk all the time, right? And you're constantly thinking about it. One of the reasons I wanted to do this presentation, this panel today, was because I knew I was going to learn a tremendous amount today. And it's basically me sponging to be able to say, how can I do this? You wind up reading books that really go to show you that in leadership, everybody thinks that attorneys are driven by money. But really we're not. In all leadership work, they're driven by values and a sense of accomplishment and being. And money comes in like fourth. I mean, really. That in the end, the work that we do and the pride that we take in it is really something really important. And as a leader, it is your job to stoke that fire, to keep that going. And that means that as a leader, you really lose yourself, and the accolades belong to others. And your job is really to be the one that's navigating and watching other people succeed. And when you take leadership at that level, it is an incredibly enriching experience. And so, as we talk about that, obviously there's these tragedies like I spoke about, but some of the work that has to be done in leadership is completely different than lawyering. It literally is this ability to say, I am going to create the values of this organization with the input of all my colleagues so that they can be the best they can be. You know, for me, one of the reasons that this leadership is important is there was a model in public defense and government work that, oh, they'll do it for 3 or 4 years and then they'll quit. We got 2 or 3 good years, right? One of the things I came to realize is every time I lost an attorney with 5 to 7 years experience, I was losing a $750,000 investment in salary. I was losing experience level. And so poor people were not getting attorneys who had the influence in courts because they were leaving. And I said, how are we going to ensure that poor people get attorneys that have the same level of court sort of credibility than private attorneys that might otherwise have left us? So for me, it was an issue of equity. The leadership that I was doing was an issue of equity for our clients, to ensure that I kept that 10-year attorney that might be burning out and wanting to leave to stay rejuvenated so that they could be the 10-year, really well-thought-of attorney to help poor people. So leadership is, you just look at it differently.
Excellent. And this is a great quote from General Colin Powell that really kind of sums up this point that they're looking at what you do, not just what you say. So what are they seeing? And a couple of things that leaders can do from like a more organizational perspective, like the interpersonal interactions are really important, but from a more organizational perspective, interpersonal conflict. A recent study on interpersonal conflict found that it was one of the largest reducible organizational costs and the single most important workplace stressor for organizations to address. It's highly related to depression, interpersonal conflict at work. So what are things that you can do? Like, we're so good at fighting with others, it's part of our job of being great advocates, but oftentimes lawyers aren't that great at handling interpersonal conflict among their own colleagues. And so thinking about training and paying attention and development around that area is something that really can help advance well-being in the organization. And another one that people don't think about as related to well-being, and it really, really is fairness. Procedural and distributed fairness, which we all learned in law school, it's also highly related to depression. When people feel like they're not being treated fairly at work, it really harms their well-being and, of course, their engagement. So as leaders, what can you do to really make people feel that they're treated fairly, they're being listened to, there's transparency, they have information? It can really help boost engagement.
So I have a question for Christine along those lines. So in district attorney offices, more so than in public defender offices, you may have higher directives, right? You've got you got an attorney general, you've got a Department of Justice. These are going to be our charging policies. These are going to be our priorities. What happens when there's like a big shift in a leader or administration? What do you think might help that lawyer stay for the long term when you've got those conflicts and they feel that they may be treated unfairly?
I think I'll answer that in a slightly different way.
Okay.
Prosecutors have a very high ethical obligation. It is probably the highest ethical obligation that's imposed on any lawyer. The ethical obligations imposed on a prosecutor are higher than those imposed on a criminal defense attorney. Probably the ethical standards on a criminal defense attorney are the same as on most lawyers, but prosecutors have a higher standard. That standard requires, for those of you who are litigators, we have to turn over exculpatory or potentially exculpatory information, which means that we have to turn over the bad stuff about our cases. Most lawyers don't have to quite do it that way. So though that definition of what our ethical obligations are has evolved over time and become more stringent. And if you want to be a prosecutor, you have to embrace that ethical obligation, and that's the right thing to do. But it is a stressor. And it can be a stressor where, for example, you strongly believe that someone that you are prosecuting is guilty and dangerous and may hurt people. Just assume that to be the case. But there are factors in your case that you have to turn over to the defense, and the defense, as they should, takes full advantage of that. and may then undermine your case. This is very difficult at times, and it is what a prosecution is. But because you have this higher ethical standards, you can't react in the way that a criminal defense attorney can. So you feel like it's unfair. There's an aspect of unfairness. But I think this is where leadership comes in, where the leader, regardless of who it is and whatever administration comes in, has to make this group of lawyers, these prosecutors, understand that if you are a prosecutor, this is what comes with the job. And this is what it's about, and this is what our democracy is about, and you should feel proud that that is the result, as opposed to this sort of, when you're a litigator, you want to win. So you've got to get away from that, though, of course, you're worried about safety for people. But so there are these tensions that come from this heightened ethical responsibility that one side of the case, the prosecutors have, that the other side may not, and that needs to be reconciled in a way that makes prosecutors feel proud of what they do.
Thank you.
One of the things that I wanted to follow up on is this notion of workplace fairness. When I came into my position, I came into an office that had a ton of grievances. And luckily, I had been trained in employment law in law school. I thought to be an employment lawyer. And that turned out to be the greatest leadership training for me in running an office, because within 5 years, I basically cleared the decks of all grievances. And I took a tremendous amount of pride that we went through 7 years without a single grievance. That literally we were able to settle things. People would bring in a concern and we'd say, okay, let's figure out how we're going to settle this. So I started having a very different scorecard for how I viewed myself as a leader. One of the hardest parts in being a leader is that we are trained to win. You're right. When I get discovery from a prosecutor that I know is going to help me, the instinct to win gets really intense. One of the hardest things as a leader is to basically tamper that winning thing down. To understand winning is a very different thing. And the goal is to create a process where everybody feels heard. Because if people feel heard, and there is a process for dissension within an office to be heard, that all of a sudden lessens the needs for grievances, right? And so that to me is a part of leadership in government offices that oftentimes is very difficult for people to understand. That notion of how it is that you ensure that everybody feels that they're equitably paid, that they're equitably assigned assignments, that they're equitably recognized for their achievements, that they're equitably assessed and given support when they need it. And I came to realize that for us to be able to do that, we have to be incredibly adept at working with human resources departments, working with county councils, ensuring that we triangulate every problem to ensure that we handle it the best way possible. Because oftentimes in the adversarial system way of solving that we were taught as trial lawyers, we lose that capacity to create this broad win-win reality. Because it really does mean that everybody walks out thinking, I got a little something and I feel heard. And you know what? That's as good as I can expect. And if you don't do that job right, people don't have faith in you. And the reality is we work in offices that deal with interpersonal conflict all the time, because the stress causes us to implode. We don't have the capacity to explode. We just can't do it. And I know friends of mine who are on the prosecution side that wish they could say things to the press that they're just not allowed to, right? Similarly in the defense. How is it that we avoid this implosion within our own midst because we're so upset that we can't explode as a stress reliever? And I think that learning how to deal with interpersonal conflict in the office is really a good. There's another book that I'd like you to sort of take note. It's called The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. Those of you that work in team offices, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team is a wonderful thing, because what it teaches you is that great ideas and great movements are actually propelled by a little bit of conflict. And we have to be okay accepting conflict. That we have to be okay in accepting the fact that there's going to be this engine of conflict where ideas are going to be brought out. And when you teach an organization to accept appropriate conflict in sort of the idea realm, you're actually very surprised at the progress that is made, because they will fight, but they will fight with ideas, and it leads to incredible growth in an organization.
Yeah, and that's the distinction in the team research is the interpersonal conflict is toxic, but conflict about ideas is productive and creative. And so it's figuring out how to help lawyers make that distinction. We're not attacking the person. This isn't about you. It's about the idea. Yeah. All right, so now we're going to get to some of the individual resources. This is the DREAM framework, again, really quickly. And we're going to start with energy, and specifically emotion regulation, which is the idea of curbing negative emotions and self-talk and boosting positive emotions. I'm going to skip over that. So the unfortunate thing about us humans is that we have evolved to have a negativity bias. That when we're evolving out in the tundras, it was much more beneficial and adaptive to overpredict bad stuff, like thinking that that branch is a snake and reacting really strongly to it and running helped keep us alive. So lucky us, we're now still wired that way, so that we have a negativity bias, which means we notice negative stuff more often, and we are more impacted by it, and it stays with us longer. So we already have that natural negativity bias, and then kind of take everything it is to be a lawyer. We sort of have this storm of negativity that's a natural part of our jobs. So it sort of creates an environment where ill mental health becomes sort of more likely. There's this petri dish of negativity on top of our bias. And so what the research shows is that what we're aiming toward is a positive emotional style in the midst of the negativity storm that we may have in our jobs. And what a positive emotional style means is that because bad is stronger than good, because we're going to notice negativity more and be more impacted by it, to get to optimal functioning, to be our best and to have high well-being, we need to get more positive emotions than negative emotions. And it's sort of about where the scientists are sort of identifying as like 3 to 1. Like a bad thing is 3 times as strong as a good thing. And so I get a lot of like pushback on this. Positive emotions, like, are you kidding me? I'm a serious lawyer doing serious work. But yeah, I'm absolutely serious. And I needed to be convinced of this. When I first started studying this area, I was all about meaningfulness, but positive emotions, I thought that's rainbows and unicorns. I'm not so sure about that. But the more that I saw the research, the more that I was convinced that it's not just that that well-being comes from happiness, like they are reciprocal. When we are happy, we have greater well-being. When we have greater well-being, we are happy. And so there's tons of research showing that happier people, this positive emotional style, has all these better indicators of health. Longevity, better immune system, better cardiovascular functioning, just sort of better. And also people who have this positive emotional style, there's a whole nother pile of research showing they're more successful. They're more influential, people see them as more effective leaders, all these good things. So what we're trying to figure out is like, what is this positive emotional style? How can we develop it? Because we're going to be better off from a health perspective and more effective leaders. The reverse is the negative emotional style, where we tend toward negativity. And the risk of depression is very high with the negative emotional style. And it's where lawyers tend to be because we have so much negativity in our work environments, and we're sort of trained to identify all the bad stuff that's going on because it helps us be good lawyers. And so we're sort of prone to this issue. And once our mood drops a little bit and we start having a little bit of a depressive mood, the world changes. Like we were, underscoring earlier that a lot of our stress is perception. And when your mood drops a bit, you perceive all challenges as greater. Everyone else is more annoying. Like everything else in your environment has a bit of a gray cloud over it. It impairs your functioning as a lawyer. It impairs your relationships. So where we want to go is the opposite direction. I'm not going to go through these. We're going to talk specifically about, so how do we get these positive emotions? One way to reduce positive emotions that you've probably all heard a lot about is mindfulness meditation. And there's lots of general benefits to mindfulness meditation, including higher resilience to stress and greater positive emotions. And we heard a little bit earlier, I think someone was talking about vicarious trauma. And there's also this sort of generally talked about as empathy stress fatigue. People have called it compassion fatigue, but that's sort of a misnomer. Our compassion doesn't ever run out. But the research shows when we're overly empathetic, when we take on the pain of others, that's where our well-being can be harmed. And so what the research shows, if we can shift it to compassion, like we will immediately feel the pain of folks that we see, so that it's about being mindful so that we can shift our mindset into compassion, that I feel for you, I want to help you, I feel compassion for you, rather than I actually am taking on your pain. And that is the kind of response that results in empathy, distress, fatigue, and can lead to burnout, and to lower well-being and depression. And do you guys have any experience with the compassion fatigue stuff about how are you handling it in your work environments?
I tell you where I'm seeing it now is in the immigration issue. In public defender world, we're now representing a lot of people that have immigration issues as part of our duties under Padilla versus Kentucky. And one of the things that is incredibly difficult is the life history that a lot of our immigrant clients bring. And if they come into the criminal justice system trying to develop a plea bargain or go to trial to try to lessen the immigration consequences of their situation. And one of the things that we find is that people take that really hard. I mean, it's very, very hard to kind of know that if you lose something, somebody's going to go back to, one of the highest murder rates in Salvador, or Guatemala, or Honduras, and it's very, very difficult. And the compassion that they feel, I see it, and I try to minimize it and say, look, we do what we can do, and we keep moving forward. But it really is very, very difficult. I sometimes will try in compassion, fatigue situations to try to use humor. And sometimes it's very hard in compassion situations to use humor. But I always tell, when I see somebody, oh, Jose, I lost this. I said, when I was a young attorney, this prosecutor said to me, Jose, why are you going to trial on this case? You're going to lose. And I said, let me get this straight. I've lost to good attorneys. I've lost to bad attorneys. I've lost to people that still hadn't gotten their bar card. I've lost to people that were law students. No, I think I got this losing thing down. I think I can do it, right? And it's just a way to lessen the impact of this reality that as public defenders we live through. We're going to lose oftentimes many more cases than we will have won because of the situation that we have, right? And so it's really trying to, as much as possible, help people put into context the work that we do. And in some ways, encouragement, time off. I like to send attorneys to trainings as a way of getting them to see a bigger world in order to be able to get away from this compassion fatigue. But yes, I see it. I see it. And the sad part is some people the only solution to the compassion fatigue is to leave the work that they're doing.
I know we're running short on time. We've got about 10 minutes, but I'll just add a little bit to that. In our office, and I'm a federal public defender, we have a lot of what they call illegal reentries. People have been deported in the past. May have been a conviction of 20 years ago. They come back and they want to, first send them to prison for a while and then deport them. And so part of the way that we've dealt with that is we've been very creative in our litigation, right? We've actually gone to trial on illegal reentries and won. We've actually had motions to dismiss based upon the underlying faulty immigration procedures and won. We've tapped into a feeling from some of the judges that feel this is unfair. So we're giving them the legal avenues, factual avenues, the equitable arguments to actually get some traction. And that's been a huge sea change in our district where people would laugh at the fact you got an illegal reentry and you're asking for bail. Next case. And now we actually get judges who are granting bail, who are letting people out, who are letting them to litigate, taking into consideration the background, even if they have to sentence them. So that's another way that we've got to be more
accomplishment and meaningfulness.
Right,
yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. And the positive emotions point, like humor, is such a good point. I'm going to talk some more about ways to to promote positive emotions in the workplace, and humor is a really great one. And just sort of generally, there's lots of research now on positive emotions saying that it contributes to resilience. So like a study, for example, that was done after the 9/11 tragedy, there was already an ongoing study going on, and so they were studying well-being, like sort of resistance, resilience to depression, and that sort of thing. And what they found was that the participants who had a tendency toward positive emotions, finding humor, finding ways to still laugh in the midst of really awful stuff, had higher resilience to stress. They had lower depression, lower other mental health disorders. So this idea, again, of positive emotions, like it's not the icing on the cake, that it really is an important part of well-being because it keeps us out of the depressed state. So what are some other ways that we can do it for ourselves and for our colleagues in the work environment? First, like the plan positivity, like yes, there are studies showing if you actually plan more positive things to do to make sure you do it intentionally rather than just going sort of mindlessly through your work and your days, you are more likely to experience positive emotions and therefore more likely to have well-being. So you might think about alone or with colleagues, at the beginning of every week, thinking about what are some things that we know make us happy, that make us feel uplifted, whether it's meaningfulness or accomplishment or humor. What are ways that we can make sure we get that into our workday to offset all the bad stuff that we know is going to happen? And next is positive emotional contagion. So what you do yourself, positive emotions and negative emotions are both contagious. So if you walk in a room uplifted and smiling and enthusiastic, everyone around you is going to start responding in the same way. And if you walk into the room with a cloud over your head and negative and looking at your phone and not interacting with anyone, they're going to respond to that as well. And so you're helping to create your own environment. So how they behave is then going to come back to you. So if you can lift the mood, they're going to behave in a more open and bonding, respectful way to you because of the way that you're behaving when you walk in. So this contagion idea is really important. I think so many of us as busy lawyers, we're just sort of marching around through our busy days and not thinking of the impact we're having on everyone around us that then comes back to us because of the culture that we're creating. So there's both projecting your own positive emotions. These are my niece and nephew, by the way. We're projecting positive emotions so that we instigate the contagion that way, and also instigating positive emotions. So in addition to smiling and being upbeat myself, how can I do kind things or express gratitude to my colleagues and folks around me so I can lift their positive emotions that way? And I do want to emphasize, like, this idea of positive emotions is not about faking it. Faking positive emotions isn't helping anyone, and it's related to burnout. And the folks that you're interacting with are very likely to detect that it's deceptive and manipulative. And so what I'm really talking about is generating positive emotions. So if you're going into an important meeting that you want it to go well and other people to respond well to you and be effective, thinking about just taking a moment before you walk in to do whatever you need to do. Like as an athlete before all my games, I would sort of get myself into the right state of mind. Same thing when you're interacting with other people. Just think about something that will upsurge your emotional state just a little bit before you walk in, and then you're more likely to have the emotional contagion effect than if you're just doing the mindless walking around of just trying to get to the next thing. And next is gratitude is one of the most widely studied positive emotions in the positive emotion literature. And it's amazing the kinds and breadth of impact that it has, both on mental health and physical health. And there's all kinds of ways that have been studied to boost gratitude. Individually, it would be things like starting as soon as you wake up. Think about 5 things that you're grateful for so that you set sort of your intention and the way that you're looking at your environment throughout the day by thinking about things for which you're grateful as soon as you wake up. There's also the gratitude journal has been well studied, and now there's lots of apps that will remind you, hey, log in and say like 3 things that you're grateful for every night or once a week or whatever it is. And there's also how do we spread it to others. There was a firm that I'm working with recently that just sent out a bunch of little cards and asked their lawyers and their staff to write down on the cards things for which they were grateful for and sending it to the person to whom they were grateful. And when the idea first came up, they were like, not sure whether this is going to go over. Lawyers kind of don't like anything touchy-feely. And they were astonished and pleasantly surprised that they've now had to reprint the cards 3 different times because it was such a hit. So super easy, not expensive. How do we display and communicate more gratitude? I'm feeling, how are we doing?
We have 3 minutes.
I'm feeling movement over there.
That's right. Right.
Okay.
I'm looking, I'm not checking my text, I'm looking at the clock.
We'll just finish this up. We won't get to meaningfulness, unfortunately, but everything that I'm talking about is going to be in the materials.
Right.
I have the dream framework and a bunch of strategies that you can use both as leaders and individuals to follow up on these things. But let me talk just quickly about acts of kindness, another area where there's tons of research now showing that being kind to others, it both benefits their well-being and our own well-being. Generally, the kind actor is the one who has the even higher boost in well-being than the folks that are receiving. And so there's multiple studies. One was a study that was just asking the participants to think of someone that you're now going to just be more supportive and empathetic and helpful to them, over the next 3 weeks. And we're going to have you check in periodically, and we're going to monitor your well-being. And just doing that was thinking consciously, not necessarily telling them hey, I'm doing nice things for you, but just yourself that you're doing it, decrease depression, raise life satisfaction. And in this other study that I like calling year-round Secret Santa at work, because it was all done anonymously, what the study organizers did was they just picked 5 people randomly and assigned them to you. Here's your 5 people, don't tell them, just find random acts of kindness that you can do throughout the week. So buy them, not expensive or big things, like buy them their favorite cup of coffee, cheer them up, buy them a little gift, all of these little things. And what they found was that the givers, the people that were assigned to the giving position, decreased depressive symptoms, increased job and life satisfaction, these really good benefits. And also on the other side, the receivers who did not know they were assigned as receiving kindness, they had boosts in their well-being as well. And it had this enormous pay-it-forward effect where the receivers, again, who did not know that they were identified as receivers, themselves started doing more acts of kindness. So increased their acts of kindness by 278%. So you see this contagion effect that what we do individually in our work environment has an enormous effect that comes back to us. And I think we were going to do meaningful work, but do read the meaningful work stuff in the materials. It's one of my favorite areas.
Well, sum it up in 1 minute.
Sum it up in 1 minute. Meaningful work is really important, and one of the major factors buffering against burnout and depression.
Right.
So you guys have kind of naturally occurring meaningfulness in your work. So it's more about making sure you are mindful about it more frequently, and in your colleagues in leadership capacity, helping to remind others of the great work that they're doing and the positive impact that they're having in the world, so we don't just get taken down by all the negativity and the stress and the conflict, that we remember what we're doing has a great impact.
Right. Thank you very much. So before I ask you to join me in thanking this distinguished panel, I just want to let you know that the materials, you can find them in a 3-step process. You got to go to the ABA Criminal Justice Section website, right? Once you're on the Criminal Justice Section website, you go to the link that takes you to the annual meeting, and in that section will be all the materials for all the CLEs presented by the Criminal Justice Section, including our own. So there's one current document that has a lot of information on there. We're going to upload a couple others, so you can find it that way. And if you run into any problems, you can always get a hold of me. I'm on the app. But in the meantime, thank you all very much, and Christine, Jose, for your thoughtful information. And thank you for being here. And now you know the message I'm talking about taking back to your offices and to your colleagues. Thank you.